I'm Jessica Ganawa, a lecturer in international relations at Flinders University in Australia, and I'm talking today with Maksym Yali, a professor of international relations at the National Aviation University in Kyiv, Ukraine. Maxim, can you start by commenting on reports that chemical weapons were used today in Mariupol? What do we know about this so far, and what are the implications?
Well, of course, besides it's my native city, Mariupol, that's why, of course, I'm following all the news. So as for information known for today, that it was used in a big steel plant Azovstal, where our just soldiers already concentrated, I would say. And Russians knew that it would be very difficult to occupy this territory, because this plant was built last century, before Second World War. So there are a lot of special buildings underground, etc. So before it was launched, I mean, chemical attack, Russians, so-called Republic DNR, asked Russian generals to use chemical weapons, and just a few hours later they did it. So so far, about 3 people suffered. One old lady suffered the most, as information known. So they used it not in that scale, very big scale. And from my point of view, they just tried in a small proportion to check up the reaction of the West, because, as you know, President Biden mentioned that if Russia uses chemical weapons, the reaction would be serious. So they want, first of all, to check up the reaction of the West. And if it is slow, if they don't impose serious sanctions after it, try to check up the situation, they will use it in a much bigger scale. I'm definitely sure. Because, as you know, it's impossible for journalists, for any specialists to get into Mariupol. It's totally blocked, encircled for more than 40 days already. And of course, there is no information. Of course, they will not let anybody to get there. So the second goal was also political, I would say, because they are trying to destabilize the situation inside Ukraine, because hundreds of thousands of people who have relatives in Mariupol, of course, are worried about that, and they do special informational operations. Just the goal is like to say, President Zelensky gave up Mariupol and Ukrainian armed forces, and they did it in spite, etc., etc. So to undermine the belief of Ukrainian people, not only to Zelensky, but also to Ukrainian armed forces, and to shake the situation. So these are 2 key goals, I would say. And of course, I'm sure this is not the last chemical attack, because, as you know, the commander-in-chief of so-called special operation, as they call it in Russia, General Dvornikov, used to be the commander-in-chief of the operation of Russian troops in Syria, and they used their chemical weapons for many times.
Yeah, and can you comment on whether you assess that this specific incident will be some kind of turning point in terms of the response from NATO and from the US?
Well, you know, I can't be sure, because we hope that the turning point would be when they occupied the biggest atomic station near Zaporizhia, biggest atomic station, nuclear station nuclear energy, station in Europe, and they shelled it even. It was not a turning point. Then we hoped that a turning point would be after international community, politicians would see the massacre they made in Bucha and suburbs of Kiev. Unfortunately, no. So I guess we also keep hoping for the strict reaction of the West, that they would impose more serious sanctions, most important in energy sector after it. But, well, we'll see. There are so many victims already. There are so many distractions, but unfortunately, the West, first of all, the United States still hesitate with strict reaction. And of course, the United States and European Union, because they are the biggest importers of Russian oil and gas, and this is the biggest. So they are the sponsors of this war. I mean, they keep paying $1 billion to Russia. So, and of course, and for example, as the head of foreign policy of European Union, Mr. Borrell mentioned, we paid to Russia 35 billion euros. It was a week ago, and only gave 1 billion euros for support with weapons to Ukraine. So you can understand the difference. That's why Russians keep doing what they are doing, and vice versa, not being able to occupy the whole territory, to conquer our army. They keep doing terrorist attacks on civilians, on civilian infrastructure, and killing more and more people, thousands of them. Actually, in Mariupol, officially already they mentioned that more than 10,000 people were killed. President Zelensky mentioned it just yesterday.
Yeah. And on a more personal note, I know that you've been involved with evacuating your mother and your sister from Mariupol. We've all seen how dire the situation is in that city right now. Can you talk a little bit more about how your mother and your sister succeeded in leaving the city?
Yes, I can. It was a very difficult task because, as I mentioned, Russian occupiers blocked the city, and they didn't let civilians to flee. They block humanitarian corridors. They don't let Ukrainian authorities to evacuate civilians. There were at least 7 tries, and Russians agreed. But then when these buses and humanitarian aid, first of all, was approaching to Mariupol, they started shelling. And that was the problem, because also there was an order to Russian soldiers to kill civilians who are trying to flee by their own cars. And there are many cases when civilians were killed. Even after that so-called green corridors were opened for evacuation by cars. So the most difficult was to find a person in nearby villages, because there is no connection with Mariupol all the time since the 2nd of March. It was the last time when I managed to reach my mother and sister. They denied to leave. I was begging them many times, but unfortunately they denied. That time the situation was not so crucial, and the district where they lived was more or less safe, I would say. But then I lost the connection and didn't have any connection for 3 weeks. So I had also a niece, my sister's daughter there, with 2 small children. She managed to flee just I guess in the in the middle of March. So she was in Berdyansk. It's also like a town 85 kilometers away from Mariupol, and it's like a hub for those who flee, for civilians from Mariupol. And we were looking for the person by car, who has a car and who evacuates people, who help to evacuate people. There are some volunteers. So we managed to find such a person. I managed to have a deal with him because you need money. It's also important. And the problem is that you can't just send him via internet some money. You need cash. That's the problem because Russians block everything there. You can't just cash the money from any bank accounts, etc., etc. So I needed to find some person who could give him this money for petrol, and of course he's risking his life. It's also you should take into account. So I found him and gave him addresses. First try failed because he found my mother. She wasn't already in her flat because everything was ruined. When I saw that pictures of houses nearby, it was a complete disaster. Just everything is ruined, burnt out, etc., etc. But luckily, she was alive, and he managed to find her neighbors who told him where she was. But the problem is that on the first day, he didn't find my sister in the basement. And my mother rejected to go without her. So there was a second try next day. Just it was her birthday. Like it's coincided. She became 78 years old, and from second try he managed to get them out to the nearby villages. Then with some volunteers, with person who were together with them, they managed to get to Berdyansk, and still it was a big problem, even though the situation was much better there. No shelling. This town is occupied by Russians. So there is electricity connection, but still they were blocking connection, and I couldn't reach them for 5 days. And moreover, Russians block these green corridors from Berdyansk because most of people evacuate just from Berdyansk. So, and luckily, just last week, they managed to leave to Zaporizhia. It's a big city next to Berdyansk, the closest city controlled by Ukrainian army, where just most of people from Mariupol, it's like the first step, the nearest point on controlled by Ukraine territories. And now, fortunately, they are safe already.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That is quite a story. And I'm glad that they're safe at the moment. As for you, I know that you're located in Kyiv. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the situation and the atmosphere is like in Kyiv at the moment?
Well, at the moment, it's much. The situation is much better than it used to be a few weeks ago, before Russian armed forces left the region. They were just next to Kiev, a few kilometers, and where I live. The situation was pretty crucial. They were also just attacks, constant air raid sirens, and also explosions. There were a few shells next to me, next to my place. Now, of course, it's better because there are no Russians outside. Kyiv is coming back step by step to normal life. So, well, I don't know. You know, I was always having my mother and sister in that hell, knowing that there is no food, there is no water, there is no electricity, constant shelling and bombarding. The most important and tragical, the most difficult is bombarding. I listened already to the stories from my sister, how she escaped the death just 1 second after she managed to get inside the shell dropped just at her place. After all that stories, I was feeling, more or less fine, realizing the difference. Even though they were attacks, even they were rocket strikes, anyway, just, it's uncomparable with that hell which is going on in Mariupol. So I didn't pay actually much attention to that. I even didn't go to the shelter. Never. Just I was staying at home. And of course now it's like more or less okay. Of course, Kiev is still. You can't compare how it looked like before the 24th of February, because there are a lot of militaries, checking points, etc. You can't go outside after 9 p.m., etc. But anyway, in comparison with what is going on in Donbass, it's a paradise, I would say.
Yeah.
For me at least. Of course, people are still in shock, but they never saw it. Women, children, of course, it's a stressful situation, but anyway, it's much better than it used to be.
Understood. Yeah. And finally, could you tell us what is the best way for those outside Ukraine to support at the moment?
Well, I would say, and what I'm trying to do myself, giving interviews to international media, because I differentiate people and politicians. So most of people all around the world supporting Ukraine, watching that awful videos, reading about that crimes against humanity, about rape, not only women, but even children. There are a lot of cases of rapes, women, schoolgirls, and even just a 2-year-old boy was raped, late information, and he was captured already in Russia by Russians. So a lot of such cases. I'm not talking about what they left, how many people they killed. Of course, most of the people all around the world support us. But politicians, unfortunately, hesitate with reaction, and they didn't expect that Ukrainian people would fight. They didn't expect that President Zelensky would stay. They proposed him to leave, as you know, President Biden proposed, and many politicians, and they would be in much better position. I would say they would prefer him to flee and for us to give up, just to get back to business as usual. I mean, European politicians, etc., etc. But they have to react. They understand and they see the reaction of their people. They want to be re-elected. And of course, what we need, and what I asked, and what President Zelensky and everybody who realized the situation, what we need from the West governments, 2 key points. First of all, to impose sanctions on energy sector, as I mentioned before, because first of all, European Union keep buying oil and gas, and these are two main sources to finance this war for Russia. And second, what we need, and also ask Australian government to supply us necessary weapons. Okay, you cannot. NATO, for example, you cannot and you don't want, you are afraid of to close the sky on Ukraine, okay? But give us air defense systems, because this is the biggest problem, because Russians, well, they have aircrafts and they're bombarding civilians. Like you saw that pictures, awful pictures of Mariupol, it was mostly destroyed by bombardments. And also anti-rocket systems, because they destroy not only military but civilian infrastructure, and also kill civilians with rockets. That's what we need, because we are lack of it. That's the two main things we need from international community: to impose sanctions and to give us necessary weapons for us to close the sky.
Yeah, thanks, Maxim. Stay safe, and I really appreciate the update.
You're welcome.